The Lydian mode has a floaty, dreamlike brightness that is elevated beyond the standard major scale. This particular sound isn't used a lot in pop or rock, but will be recognisable from the huge amount of film scores and soundtracks that use it. If you want to write a Lydian mode riff, then you need to understand the notes that go into the Lydian mode. The major scale is an excellent point of comparison for all other scales and modes. If I label the major scale, also known as the Ionian mode, with the scale degrees 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and 7, then the Lydian mode would have the scale degrees 1, 2, 3, sharp 4, 5, 6 and 7. When writing Lydian mode riffs, you want to try and highlight the notes that create a uniquely Lydian sound. In this case, it is very obvious which note this is. The only note of difference with the major scale is the sharp 4. Let's look at an example now to explore the mode further. C Lydian has the notes C, D, E, F sharp, G, A and B. You saw that the sharp 4 note is critical for the Lydian sound. The third note is also important because it indicates that this is a major sounding scale. A riff is a short, repeated, memorable musical phrase. Although strongly associated with rock music and the electric guitar, a riff can feature in any genre and be played on any instrument. The majority of riffs are between 1 and 4 bars in length. Any longer can sound like a melody or solo. All riffs are repeated. This is an essential part of the riff and how they hook themselves into the listener's mind. You could also call them a motif. That is a musical idea that repeats. A riff can define a song. The first thing you hear in many songs is a riff, and they are the core part of many massive hits. Riffs are like a whole song, bundled up into a short, repeatable package. As such, they are comprised of 3 main parts: rhythm, harmony, and melody. I'll use the C Lydian mode now to demonstrate some different riff ideas. I'll present guitar tabs for the riffs, but remember that these ideas can apply to any instrument or MIDI. C Lydian is a guitar-friendly key. In standard tuning, you can play any of the open strings without being out of key. As such, it can open up all sorts of easy to play riff ideas. Almost anything can be a riff, but for ease I'm going to break them into a few categories here to help you think about different riff approaches. The sound or genre that you are aiming for may dictate the riff style that you prefer. As always, trust your ear and go with it. Let's start with some interval-based riffs. An interval is simply the distance between 2 notes. Intervals are the building blocks of chords and scales. As such, they are a great point to construct a riff from. The bulk of guitar riffs are played on the lower 3 strings. The E, A and D strings have power and authority associated with bass notes, as the bass generally defines the harmony above it. Denser strings also produce more volume. Because of this, I'll focus on these lower registers in the example. If you are working with a scale, such as C Lydian here, you can experiment by playing 2 notes in the scale that create an interval you like the sound of. Once you find the interval you like, then you can work on the rhythmic idea for your riff. For example, here is a simple riff using 2 notes in the C Lydian scale, C and F sharp. This interval is a distance of 3 whole steps or 6 semitones. This is known as an augmented 4th interval or a tritone. I'll play the interval and then develop the rhythm of the riff. So much of the riff writing process is experimentation. Grab your instrument and have fun with it. Intervals can be played horizontally like we just saw. This is what you would find in a melody, or you can stack them vertically. That is when both notes are played at the same time. This is how chords are created. In the next example, I'll play notes from the C Lydian mode at the same time. Listen to how this changes the sound. Each interval will have an open E note in it. Repeating a note like this in a riff is known as a pedal note. I'll discuss this in more detail later. Look out again for the development of the rhythm in this example. You will have heard in the last example how important the rhythmic element was. The rhythm of a riff is what really makes it unique. A lot of riffs utilise syncopation to generate this rhythmic interest. This is where the weak beats in the bar are accented rather than the usual strong beats. For example, in 4/4 time signatures, there are 4 beats in a bar. Usually the strong beats are 1 and 3, and the weak beats 2 and 4. But if we turn this on its head, then you create a syncopated rhythm. And if you utilise notes that don't fall on any of the beats, then it will feel even more syncopated. We've looked at some of the notes in the C Lydian scale, but what creates the Lydian sound? At the beginning of the video, I showed you how the only point of difference between the major scale and the Lydian mode is the sharp 4 note. So this note is critical to the Lydian brightness. You also want to highlight that Lydian is a major sounding scale. This is heard through the use of the 3rd note. and also the root note of the scale so you know where the tonic or home is. Here's an example that highlights these notes: C, E and F sharp. It starts with these 3 key notes with a hammer on from E to F sharp as the high point. Then it descends back down to C via D. The root note C is the lowest in the riff to highlight its role as the tonic. Lydian is an interesting mode that can cause a few problems for songwriters. This is because it is harmonically unstable. Every mode has a major scale with the same notes. For example, C Lydian has the notes C, D, E, F sharp, G, A and B, and G major / Ionian has the notes G, A, B, C, D, E and F sharp. It's unstable because the raised fourth and the tonic or first note of the scale creates a tritone. Tritones are a series of 3 whole note intervals that are found in diatonic scales. Tritones create tension that want to resolve to the next stable interval. You will have heard this in the first riff example. In a typical major scale, the tritone is between the 4th and 7th scale degrees. This tritone resolves perfectly to the major scale's 1st and 5th scale degrees, the 2 most stable notes of the scale. However, because Lydian's tonic note is part of the tritone, the only resolution you get is when the 4th scale degree moves up to the 5th scale degree. Here's the tritone notes in C Lydian, C and F sharp, followed by the 5th note G. This creates a partially resolute sound, creating an open, floating sense of mystery that never feels entirely resolved. You may have noticed in the earlier examples I avoided this 5th note. Let's look at a riff in C Lydian now with this note involved. Listen to how it draws the ear towards it. The last example showed you how important the tonal centre of Lydian riffs are. It can easily begin to feel like you are in the major scale with the 5th note as its first note. This is because it provides strong resolution and a feeling of being the home or tonic. Always be mindful of this note if you are trying to create a distinctly Lydian riff. If in doubt, you can avoid it entirely. Let's now talk about pedal note riffs. A pedal note is one that remains the same, usually low down in the arrangement, whilst other notes or chords change above it. This will usually use open E, A and D strings on the guitar. If the note doesn't sustain throughout the riff, it may also be referred to as a pedal point. It will often be the root note of the relevant scale that is repeated to really anchor the listener in the key of the song, but it doesn't have to be, so feel free to experiment. If you've heard metal riffs with palm muted E strings throughout, they are an example of this. This might be one reason to try a drop tuning, like drop D, to get a suitable open note to pedal throughout your riff. You saw an example earlier that had a pedal note. Here's one in C Lydian that again uses the E open string, but also the C and F sharp notes we want to target. Now it's time for a classic riff component, the power chord. A favourite of rock and metal, the power chord is a simple, powerful element in many iconic riffs. A power chord is actually just a perfect 5th interval, so it relates back to the first 2 examples in this video. Power chords are often used with pedal notes that we discussed previously. This is particularly prevalent in metal riffs. On guitar they are usually played as 2-note chords with the 1st and 5th, or as a 3-note chord with the octave added above the 5th. A simple starting point for generating power chord riffs is to use the notes in the relevant scale for your song, and then using each note as a root note for a power chord. As with other riffs, the rhythmic element is almost more important than the actual chords being played. Here's an example in C Lydian using power chords and other single note lines. The power chord riff leads us nicely into the full-blown chord riff. As the name suggests, this is simply combining full chords into a riff. This is where the lines between chord progression and riff can become blurred. But as discussed earlier, the riff will be shorter and more rhythmically driven than a chord progression. Chord-based riffs are easy to have a go at. Just pick one or more chords from a key and start experimenting with the rhythm. For example, here are the diatonic chords in the key of C Lydian. If you want to learn more about Lydian chords and progressions, there will be a link at the end of this video. A simple and popular chord progression uses the 1 chord C major and the 2 chord D major. Let's take these chords as the basis of our riff. You can use simple chords like this, but you are not limited. Different chord types can open up interesting sounds, and on the guitar they can be the simple addition or taking away of a finger. This can add rhythmic elements that help elevate us beyond the chord progression. In the next example I explore this idea by using major 7th and add 9 versions of C and D sus4. The rhythmic variations are short enough to feel like a riff and not a chord progression. So far I've been using notes that are only in the Lydian mode, but riffs don't need to be boxed in like this. You can reach for any notes that you like the sound of. This introduces the idea of modal mixture or modal interchange. This is where you use notes from parallel scales within your riffs. Parallel scales have the same root note as the scale you are using. For example, we are using C Lydian here, so parallel scales would include C major, C mixolydian, and C harmonic minor, amongst others. A lot of riffs aren't considered in this level of detail and created more spontaneously. I'd recommend going for this approach to begin with and just reach for notes and sounds that you like. The short nature of a riff won't usually undermine the tonal centre of your song, but you can also be more deliberate and target certain chromatic notes. I'll attempt this in the next example. It's very similar to an earlier riff that targets the key C Lydian notes E and F sharp. This time I'll also utilise the chromatic F note to allow us to reach from F sharp to E in a descending half step nature. A riff can come into the songwriting process at different times. It could be that you create a great riff in isolation and this inspires you to write the rest of a song. Remember that they contain rhythm, melody and harmony. This song DNA can be unpicked from the riff and lead to quick songwriting. Concentrate on the notes that are emphasised or stand out. These will lead you to a suggested chord change. You could also take an existing chord progression and turn this into a riff. This might be by using chord notes or whole chords as we saw earlier. Or you could take a song melody and use it for your riff inspiration. This is particularly useful for finding rhythmic hooks for your riffs. Sometimes starting with some limitations can really help your riff writing process as it narrows down infinite possibilities to focus your attention. With that in mind, let's use a song I've written in other videos on the channel. This song utilises first and second inversions. These are used to change the bass notes in the chords and create movement and interest. First inversions have a 6 next to the Roman numeral, second inversions have a 6 and 4. It starts with an intro/bridge section that is repeated through the song. This is deliberately ambiguous, using chords that feature in both C major and C Lydian. As such, the listener will feel like it is a C major progression until the major 2 chord at the end of the intro. Also listen for the pace of chord changes. The first chord lasts a beat and a half, while the second is heard for 2.5 beats. This provides a nice rhythmic feel that repeats through the song. I want a nice simple riff here to introduce the song and lead to the verse. It uses chord notes that follow the rhythm of the chord changes. This shows you how other parts of your song can directly influence the riff writing process. It ends on an F sharp note played with an open A note. This is because F sharp and A are in the D major chord. In the first part of the verse, a chromatic F note is played in the melody and in the underlying D minor chord, so having the F sharp sound just before provides a nice half step movement. Have a listen to how the riff sounds, as well as the rest of the song. I hope this will inspire you to have a go at writing your own Lydian riffs. You've learned about Lydian riffs, but there's a world of Lydian songwriting out there. I've made a Lydian playlist which includes how I wrote the chords and melody in the final song here. Click that now to continue your Lydian journey.